The crime thriller that predicted a world in quarantine. Lockdown, a book by Peter May. Prologue. Her scream echoes through the dark, squeezed through a throat constricted by fear. It quivers with the terror she feels and would make the hair stand up on the arms and shoulders and neck of any caring mortal. But the thick walls of this old house wrap themselves around the horror of the night to ensure that the only ears to hear her are deaf to her plight. Her curses and hisses and spits in the dark, angry and frustrated. She can hear him on the stairs and knows that he means her harm. The man she has known and trusted, even loved. She is drowning in her own incomprehension. How is it possible? She remembers the cold touch of his hand on her fevered brow during those long torture days of sickness. The pity in his eyes which burns now with anger and malice. She holds her breath. She has gone up another flight. He thinks she is on the top floor, and she slips from the study and sees his shadows on the stairs as he heads up to the attic rooms. And she turns and hurries down, small feet padding on the thick carpet, to the light that falls through stained glass windows on the floor of the hall. Desperate fingers grasp and pull the handle, but the door is locked. There is no way out. She freezes as she hears him bellow at the top of the house. He knows he has missed her. For a moment she hesitates. The steps to the cellar lead from the bathroom below to the staircase. But she understands that if she goes down there, she will be trapped. There is only the old coal chute leading up to the alley between the house and the tiny though she is not small enough to squeeze through the gap. The house shakes with his footsteps on the stairs and she turns in panic only to find herself confronted by a little girl. A ghost in a white nightshirt, short cropped black hair, almond eyes, white and black, face etched in chalk. The sight of the child sends fear spiking through her like the stabbing blades of the knives that await her. Before she realizes, she is recoiling from her own reflection, unrecognizable, distorted by fear. Choi, she hears him bellow in the stairwell, and remembers suddenly the woman who had first shown them around the house all those months ago. The false panel in the wall of the big dining room at the front, a room they never used, a room which has simmered always in a sweltering darkness, daylight and lamplight shining in turns through the cracks around the edges of the blind. The estate agent had shifted a small table to remove the panel and reveal the door behind it, an old white painted door with a round handle which she had opened into the darkness beyond. The damp, cold, fusty darkness of a tiny brick room where a family of six had cowed in the blackout to hide from the bombs. Choi had no idea what the lady had meant by the Blitz, but she had said that when the German bombers had finished over London, they swung south again and dropped their unused cargo on his helpless burrow. And when the sirens went, people scurried like rats into their brick rat traps to listen and wait and pray in the dark. Choi hears him scream her name again, and like the sirens of more than a half century before, it sends her scurrying for the front room. Quickly, she slides the table aside and fumbles to realize the catch is on the dark blue panel. It is heavy, and her tiny hands struggle to pry it loose. She can hear him on the first landing when his footfall in the master bedroom above. She leans the panels to one side and pushes the door. It opens into the blackness, and the cold, damp air wraps itself around her. She steps inside and drags the panel back into place. She is unable to fasten it from the inside and can only pray that he will not see that. She shuts the door and all light is extinguished. She hunkers down and wraps her arm around herself for warmth. It is so cold in here, so dark, so final. There is no way out. She cannot think how six people could squeeze themselves into this place. It is beyond her wildest imagination to know how it must have felt to hear the bombs falling all around and wonder if you might be next. But she needs no imagination to picture the man she hears now on the stair, or the light catching the blade she knows he carries. The orphanage in the Gogan Dog is a distant family. The child she had been another person in another life. So much has changed in only 6 months, yet still it has seemed an eternity, and that other life just the shadow of a dream. Her breathing is shallow and rapid and seems inordinately loud. But above it, she can hear him in the front hall. Heavy footstep on the parquet flooring, the anger in his voice as he calls her name again. And then silence. A silence which stretches from moments to what seems like hours. She holds her breath now for as long as she can, for she is sure he must hear it. Still the silence. And then she gasps as she hears the scraping of the panel on the other side of the door. Her heart beats so hard it feels like someone is punching her chest. The handle turns and she presses herself back against the wall as slowly the door opens. He is still houted against the light from the hall in the doorway behind him. She can see her own breath missing in the cold air, caught by the same light. He crouches slowly and reaches a hand toward her. She cannot see his face, but she can hear him smile. Come to Daddy, he says softly. Chapter 1, Scene 1. The friends of Archbishop Spark, those who were still alive, were spitting blood. Those who were not were certain to be turning in their graves. Years of careful planning aimed at preserving this tiny patch of bleak and pleasant land for the people of Lambeth had been brushed aside by a single emergency act of parliament. A flag was hanging limply in the dark above the crenellated turrets of the palace. The archbishop was in residence, but since the bulldozers had started up at 5, after only 6 short hours of silence, it seemed unlikely that he was still asleep. Neither did it seem likely that those of predecessors who had gifted the park to the borough were resting in anything like peace. Arc lights illuminated the site. Caterpillars' tracks had churned and macerated the earth where once children had played. The echo of their tiny voices drowned out now by the roar of the machines. The railings around the football pitch and the basketball court had been ripped up and cast aside. The mangled remains of swings and climbing frames were piled up against the derelict buildings on the west side of the park, awaiting removal. The old toilet block, destined to have become a cafe, had been demolished. Time was of the essence. Hundreds of men had been assigned to these tasks. Shifts were 18 hours. No one complained. The money was good, although there was nowhere to spend it. They moved around under the lights without speaking, figures in orange overalls and hard hats and white masks. Each one kept his own counsel and is distant from the others. Cigarettes were smoked through the fine fibers of the mask, leaving around nicotine-stained patches. And a brazier was kept burning for the cigarettes in. Infection was too easily spread. Yesterday they had dug the holes for the foundations. Today the mixer lorries were arriving in fleets to fill them with concrete. A giant crane was already on site, ready to hoist and swing steel girders into place. A delegation from the emergency committee had taken the short walk from Westminster the previous afternoon to watch with hope and fear the vandalism they had sanctioned in desperation. White cotton masked their faces, but could not hide the anxiety in their eyes. They, too, had watched in silence. Now a voice rose above the churning of cement and the growl of the diggers. A single figure raising his hand in the dark, calling for a halt. He was a tall man, lean and fit, perching on the edge of a 10-foot crater in the northwest corner. The concrete chute swung wide and shuddered to a halt. It was only moments away from spewing its thick grey sludge into the earth. The man crouched on the edge of the hole and peered into its darkness. "There's something in there," he shouted, and the foreman strode angrily through the mud towards him. "We've got no time for this. Come on." He waved a thickly gloved hand towards the man whose levers controlled the concrete. "Move it." "No, wait." The tall man swung himself over the edge and dropped into the hole, disappearing from the view. The foreman raised his eyes to the heavens. "God save us. Get a light over there." A group of men crowded around the lip of the hole as a tripod rattled and the light was tilted downwards. The tall man was crouched over something small and dark. He looked up at the faces peering down at him and shaded his eyes against the glare of the light. "It's fucking Holdell," he said. "Leather fucking Holdell. Some bastard thinks we dug this hole just so he'd have somewhere to dump his crap." "Come on, get out there," the foreman shouted. "We can't afford any delays." "What's in it?" someone else called. The tall man dragged a sleeve across his forehead and removed a glove to unzip the bag. They all leaned closer to try to see for themselves, and then he jumped back, as if he had touched live electric wires. "Jesus, what is it?" They could see something white, something catching the light. The tall man looked up. He was panting, short, shallow breaths, and all color was washed from a face already pale from the lack of sleep. "Jesus Christ. What the hell is it?" The foreman was losing his patience. Carefully, the man in the hole leaned over the bag again. "It's bones," he said in a hushed voice, which was nonetheless audible to them all. "Human bones." "How do you know they are human?" The question came from one of the others. His voice seemed somehow shockingly loud. "Because there's a fucking skull looking up at me." The tall man turned his own skull upward, and his skin seemed to be stretched very tightly across it. "But it's small, too small for an adult. It's got to be a kid." Scene 2. McNeil was somewhere far away, somewhere he shouldn't have been, somewhere warm and comfortable and safe. But there was a strange nagging at the back of his mind, an uncomfortable sense of something forgotten, something missed. And then he remembered, with a sickening start, that he hadn't been to a work for months. How could he have forgotten? But he'd done it before, he knew. He had this vague recollection. Oh Jesus, how was he going to explain it? How could he tell them where he'd been or why? Oh God, he felt sick. He heard the phone ringing and knew it was them. He didn't want to answer it. What could he say? They'd been paying him all this time, and he hadn't even bothered to show up. Others must have had to cover for him, to fill in his shifts. They would be angry, accusing. And still the phone rang, and still he didn't want to answer it. "Shut up," he shouted at the phone. It ignored him, each ring a stab to his heart. It was going to carry on stabbing him until he picked it up. Sweat broke out all across his forehead. Something was sticking to him, and the more he tried to free himself, the more it stuck. He turned and pulled and kicked and woke up, gasping, staring at the ceiling with wide, frightening eyes, his short, cropped hair damp on the pillow beneath his head. The figures 657 stretched in digital fragment towards the light rose. It was the only thing he'd taken with him from the house. A gift from Sean, an alarm clock that projected infrared figures onto the ceiling. No need to turn your head to look at the clock during all those insomniac hours. There was always that big clock in the sky to remind you how slowly time could pass. Of course, he knew that it wasn't really Sean who'd bought it. Martha knew how he liked his gadgets, but it was Sean who'd had the pleasure of giving it to him. The innocent pleasure that only a child seems to derive from the act of giving, as real as the joy of receiving. McNeil disentangled himself from his sweat soaked bed sheets and swung his leg over the edge of the bed. Cold air embraced him. Wake up. The phone was still ringing, and like in his dreams, he knew that it was not going to go away. He reached for the bedside cabinet and lifted the receiver. His lips stuck to his teeth. Yeah. I hope you're sober, McNeil. McNeil unstuck his tongue from the roof of his mouth and smelled stale whiskey on his own breath. He rubbed grit and matter from his eyes. I'm not on for another 12 hours. You're on now, boy. Double shift. I figured since it's your last day, you could hack it. I'm another two-man down. Shit. Shit's right. Someone's dumped in our backyard and I've got no one else to send. McNeil tipped his head back and looked blearily at the great clock in the sky. He had no idea how else he would have filled the next 12 hours anyway. He could never sleep when it was light. What's the deal? Bones. Bunch of workmen on the site at Archbishop's Park found them at the bottom of a hole. Sounds like they need an archaeologist, not a cop. They were in a leather hotel and they weren't there yesterday. Better go straight down. The ministry shouting blue fucking murder because they've had to stop work. Wrap it up fast. I don't need this shit. McNeil winced as the phone crankled in his ear. Lang had hung up. In the bathroom across the landing, McNeil stared back at his vacant reflection as he brushed his teeth. Other people's brushes crowded together in a cloudy tooth mug. He kept all his things in his room and touched nothing in the bathroom. He even sprayed and washed the taps before touching them. He needed a shave, and few more hours of sleep might have helped ameliorate the penumbrous shadow beneath his eyes. Nothing, however, was going to undo the damage of the last few months. The mask that stress had etched on a face not yet 40. It was not an image he cared to dwell on. He scraped his razor across dark stubble and heard someone stirring in the room next door. The car salesman, when McNeil had first taken a room here, the landlord who still lived on the ground floor, had taken him through a roll call of his fellow inmates. A divorced doctor, barred from practice, who could usually rustle up a medication for most ills. A handy person to have around the house, especially these days. The car salesman, gay, the landlord thought, but not ready to accept it. There were two officials of the rail workers union, only it wasn't called that anymore and he couldn't remember what they called it now. One was from Manchester, another from Leeds, and they were serving their time on the union's executive committee in London. The union had a long-standing arrangement in the Balbec Road. There was only one woman in the house. She smelled a bit and looked like death, and the landlord was sure she was on drugs. But she paid like clockwork, so who was he to judge her? It was a strange collection of misplaced humanity living on the edge of society, in a kind of twilight zone where you neither lived nor died, just existed. When he had first moved in, was it really only 5 months ago? McNeil had felt like an outsider, someone looking in, an observer. He didn't belong and he wouldn't be staying, but they must all have thought that once. Now, like them, he couldn't see a way out. He was no longer on the outside looking in, but on the inside looking out. He had chosen this area because he felt it was somewhere he could bring Sean. It was no slum. There existed here still a sense of fairy gentility. Highbury Field was at the end of the road, somewhere he and Sean could kick a ball, walk a dog if they'd had one. Some of the street names too had a ring of foam about them. Aberdeen, Calvin, Shufford, Fergers, there was something familiar and comforting in the echoes of Scotland he had left alone ago. There was a swimming pool just up from Highbury Corner. The landlord told him it had once been open to the elements, but a less hardy generation had built walls around it and put a roof on top. Somewhere else he and Sean could spend, what was it they called it?
holiday time. And McNeil figured he would get the season tickets to go and see the Gunners at the Emirates Stadium. But Sean's mother had refused to let him cross the city to Ileton. It was too dangerous, she said, maybe when the emergency was over. McNeil pulled on his coat and turned up the collar. His suit needed pressing, and his white shirt was fraying just a little around the top of the collar. The toe button was missing, and his tie was tied to hide it. He pulled on his gloves and hurried down the straight to narrow hallway at the bottom. There was a time, even just a month ago, when the landlord would have poked his head around the door to say good morning, but now none of them spoke. They were all too afraid. Scene 3. As he pulled the door shut, he could hear his phone ringing at the top of the house. He didn't want to speak to Lang again, and so he quickly fetched his phone from his pocket and turned it off. The air in his car was icy cold as he slept behind the wheel. There had been no frost, but condensation clouded the windscreen. He set the blowers going and turned down Calabria Road. The radio was playing a selection of hits from last year. No one had released anything new in the last 2 months. The music soared from one song to another, and McNeil was glad of the absence of the mindless, prattling DJs who used to fill the early morning airways. He had missed the 7:30 newscast. As always, his route into the city was determined by the army checkpoints. Certain areas were simply off limits, even to him. There were demarcation lines that would require special permission to cross. He drove south to Pentonville, turning west along to the Pentonville Road into Euston Road. It was nearly 7:45 and the air was suffused with a grey light that forced its way through low pewtery cloud that seemed to graze the top of distant skyscrapers. In another life, taxis and buses and commuter traffic would have choked the city arteries like cholesterol. McNeil still could not get used to the empty streets. There was a chilling quiet in this early morning light. He passed the occasional troop carrier, soldier with gas masks and goggles staring from beneath khaki canvas cover, like faceless troopers from a Star Wars movie, nursing rifles they had been forced all too frequently to use. Now that there was a daylight, there was limited traffic of the private and commercial vehicle with the requisite clearance to move around designated area of the city, tracked by cameras and satellite. Controls were most stringent around the city center where much of the looting had taken place. The government had used the old congestion charting infrastructure to monitor and control all vehicles moving in and out of the area. McNeil cruised along its northern limit, passing a deserted Euston station before turning south into the Tottenham Court Road, where a camera recorded his number plate and fed it directly into the central computer. Without clearance, he could expect to be stopped within minutes. The city shopping center was like a battlefield. Those shops which hadn't already had their windows smashed had broadened them up. The burned out carcass of stolen vehicles smoldered at the roadside. The debris and the detritus of a once civilized society scattered across ruined streets. The wreckage of another night of violence. The Dominion Theatre, opposite to the Tottenham Court Road underground station, was a blackened, burnt out shell. Every time it rained, the air still filled up with the charred smell from the death of the salesman, the last piece to be performed there. McDonald's too in Oxford Street had been gutted, flame grilled burgers overcooked. The Harmony sex shop had been broken into so many times the owner no longer bothered to board it up. And a scantily clad siren in black leather pouted defiantly at McNeil as he drove past. Further south, the Mousetrap had finally ended its record-breaking run, and Stephen Martin's theatre, with all its neon lights smashed and ripped from the walls, looked sad and neglected. He was stopped at an army checkpoint at Cambridge Circus. He should have been used to it by now, but he could never feel comfortable with half a dozen of semi-automatic rifles pointed at his head. A sullen soldier glowered at him from behind his mask, keeping his distance and reaching for his paper with a latex gloved hands. He handed them back quickly, anxious to be rid of them, as if somehow they might be contaminated, which, well, they might. McNeil drove on down Charing Cross Road, through Trafalgar Square, and into Whitehall. There was more activity here, a civil service still functioning after a fashion government seeking to deal with disintegrating society. Men and women with masks leaving and entering the corridor of power with the same sense of bleak despair that gripped most of those who lived in the capital. As he neared the river, he saw black smoke rising into the heavy morning sky from the four chimneys of the old Battersea power station, a more potent symbol of human helplessness in the face of an unforgiving nature he could not imagine. How many dead was it now? 500,000, six more? No one believed the figure anyhow. There was no way to verify them, but even at their most optimistic, those the government put out were barely conceivable. The 8 o'clock news carried the story which had been running all night, but it was McNeil's first time hearing it, and it hit him hard. Shortly after midnight, doctors at Stewart Thomas Hospital had announced the death of the Prime Minister. Two of his children were already dead, and his wife was still critically ill. It had been no secret that his condition was serious. But if the most powerful person in the country could be taken so easily, what chance did the rest of them have? In Snorri's tone, the newsreader reported that there was now expected to be a power struggle between the Deputy Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer for control of the party. The Deputy Prime Minister, a sort of man whom McNeil had never liked, had the upper hand since he would automatically fill the Prime Minister's shoes, at least temporarily. Although McNeil could not understand why anyone would want to, given the circumstances. The allure of power, it seemed, was irresistible to some. Quietly, McNeil hoped that the Chancellor would win the power struggle. The present incumbent of number 11 Downing Street was, it seemed to him, eminently more sensible, a man of intelligence and conscience. As he drove across Westminster Bridge through yet another army checkpoint, he glanced west to see the 11-story facade of Stewart Thomas Hospital rising up from the south bank of the Thames. Somewhere behind the concrete and glass, the man who had once run the country lay dead, cold and powerless, infected by his own children. Beyond the three remaining original wings of the hospital, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were filled, he knew, with yet more stricken patients. Perhaps if the four other wings had not been destroyed by the Germans during the Blitz, it would not have been necessary to construct emergency overspill in the park across the road. Chapter 2, Scene 1. McNeil pulled his Ford Focus into the bus stop opposite the accident and emergency department in Lambeth Palace Road, confident in the knowledge that none of the four buses which used to traverse this road would be inconvenienced. The gates and railing at the entrance of the Archbishop's Park had been torn down to create access for the heavy equipment brought in by the contractors. He recognized the unmarked vans of the scenes of crime officers from the FSS laboratories, although they might have been quicker on foot since the lab was just a short walk away along the narrow path at the south end of the park. The Forensic Science Service had been forced to draw its resources into the one central facility following the lockdown of the capital, and had established the former Metropolitan Police Forensic Science Laboratory in Lambeth Road as the center for the most of the medical and scientific services required by the police. Right now, the officers they had sent were standing around waiting for McNeil. McNeil surveyed the wreck of the park, monstrous machinery standing idle amongst the ripped up remains of what had once been a tiny oasis of green in sea of concrete and glass. Hundreds of workers in their distinctive orange jumpsuits stood around in groups, talking and smoking. In the misty early morning light, a group of ghostly figures in white Tyvek suits and masks clustered around a hole in the ground which should by now have been filled with cement. A man in a suit wearing a calf-length element, camel coat, and a white hard hat picked his way delicately through the mud as McNeil approached. He wore a standard issue white cotton mask, as did Neil, but stopped well short of him. D.I. McNeil? McNeil kept his distance and eyed him cautiously. I, who is asking? Derek James, I'm from the office of the Deputy Prime Minister. You will understand if I don't shake your hand. What do you want? McNeil had never been slow in getting to the point. I want, said James with a certain edge, to get this side back to work. Then the sooner we stop talking about it, the sooner I'll do what I have to do and get out of your hair. McNeil walked past him towards the gathering of ghosts. James went after him, still concerned to keep his shoes mud-free. I don't think you understand, Mr. McNeil. This work is being carried out under an emergency decree of Parliament. Millions of pounds are being poured into this project. There is a strict timetable. A delay could cost lives. Someone's already dead, Mr. James, which means they are beyond help. Others are not. McNeil stopped in his tracks and turned to face the man from the ministry who immediately required, as if afraid McNeil might breathe on him. Look, everyone in this country entitled to justice, alive or dead. That's my job. To see that justice is done, and when I have done it, you can do yours. Until then, stay out of my face. He turned again and trudged through the mud to the man in Tyvek. What's the score here?
Bag of bones, Jack, one of them said, his voice muffled by his mask. They only excavated yesterday. Someone have dumped it overnight. He glanced around the hundred of faces that watched them from a distance. And these guys want us out of here too sweet. All in good time. Another of the Tyvek suit handed McNeil a pair of plastic shoe covers. Here, you better put these on, mate. McNeil pulled on the plastic and peered into the hole. There was a figure crouched in the bottom of it. Who's down there? Your old Paul. McNeil rolled his eyes. Oh shit, he said under his breath. Tom Bennett. The forensics man grinned behind his mask, stretching it tight across his face. McNeil snapped on latex gloves and reached out a hand. Help me down. It was an expensive sport halter with a Puma logo on the side. Tom was holding it open with gloved hands and looked up as McNeil dropped down beside him. Don't come too close to me, he said. You never know what you might catch. McNeil ignored him. What's in it? He asked. The bones of a child. McNeil leaned over to peer in. The bones looked very white, as if they had been left out in the sun. A sad collection of the bits and pieces of what had once been a human being. He recoiled from a stink like meat left in the refrigerator a month past its sell-by. What's the hell's that smell? The bones. A crinkle around the young pathologist's eyes betrayed his amusement at McNeil's disgust. I didn't know bones smelled. Oh yeah, 2 even 3 months after death. So this kid was alive quite recently. Very recently, I'd say, from how much they stink. So what happened to the flesh? Someone stripped it off the bones using some pretty sharp cutting gear. Tom lifted out a long shank bone, laying it delicately across both hands. The femur, thigh bone to you. You can see the scores left in the bone by the knife or whatever it was he used. They're quite deep and broad, so it was a heavy instrument. McNeil looked at the cuts and grooves in the bone, most running parallel and cut in at an angle, as it formed a repeated sideways chopping motion. Not an expert then. I don't know who I'd describe as an expert in cutting flesh from bone, but it's a pretty crude job. Tom ran a long, delicate finger around the bulk of the joint. You can see the hash they have made of the disarticulation and those dried out remnants of tissue and ligaments that they couldn't get off. McNeil looked into the bag again and carefully lifted out what looked like the curve of a small rib. He cocked his head and looked at it curiously, running his fingers along the smooth white bow of it. How did they manage to get the bones so clean? Tom shrugged. Washed them likely. I've done it myself from time to time. When I wanted to clean up a skull, boiled it up with a little bleach and laundry detergent. Wouldn't that kill the smell?
Tom crinkled with amusement again. The marrow's still going to rot, whether you've cooked it or not. McNeil slipped the rib back into the bag and stood. He peered up at the faces leaning over to try to catch their conversation, then looked down at Tom. Can you tell what sex? Not right now, but I'd put the age at somewhere between 9 and 11. McNeil nodded thoughtfully and wondered how you performed an autopsy on a disarticulated skeleton. Almost as if he'd read his thoughts, Tom stood up beside him and said, naturally, I can't do any kind of real autopsy. All I can do is lay out the bones and look for clues. A stray strand of blonde hair was caught in the elastic of his plastic shower cap, and his corn blue eyes held McNeil in a gaze so direct that the older man had to look away. Of course, he said, I'm not much of an expert on what goes where. I can sort out the ribs, but not in the correct order. I can separate the finger bones, but not necessarily which goes to which hand. We really need an anthropologist for that. McNeil forced himself to meet the pathologist's eye. Is there a problem? She's sick. Oh, but I can make a general assessment, spot any major bone injuries and missing parts, recover tissues from the marrow, and order up some toxicology. He paused. I'd suggest we get Amy in. She's good with skulls and she's done a lot of work on human ID. McNeil felt his heart skip a beat at the mention of her name, and he wondered if it showed in his face. A slight blush, perhaps. It sensed Tom watching him closely as if looking for some sign. But if he was, it did not betray itself in his eyes. Sure, if that's what you think, McNeil said. He turned and reached up a hand to be helped out. Careful, Tom said quickly. Some people think it's dangerous to turn their back on me. McNeil turned his head slowly to look at him. It was a dark, dangerous look that needed no words. Tom smiled. You're so butch. Silence hung over the sight like a low-lying fog. It was extraordinary, really here in the very heart of the capital. No traffic noise, no voices raised in the casual communication or amusement, no overheard roar of jet engines as planes circled toward Gatwick or Heathrow. Just the plaintive cries of the seagulls which had flown up the estuary to escape the stormy weather in the North Sea. Fragments of white wheeling overhead, for all the world like vultures waiting for death. Death had already come, but there was nothing left on the bones to pick. McNeil was aware of all the faces watching him. The man from the ministry stood off, arms folded across his chest. Well, I want everyone off the site, McNeil said. We're going to seal it off and make a search. The man from the ministry tilted his head to one side, only his eyes betrayed his anger. There'll be trouble, he said. There'll be trouble if anyone doesn't do as they're told. McNeil raised his voice so that everyone on the side could hear him. This is a murder scene. Scene 2. What the fuck did you say to him? I told him it was a murder scene and we were going to search the site. Link looked at him skeptically. Well, whatever you said, he's pretty pissed off. You have any idea what kind of shit's coming down on me right now? I can imagine. Can you? Link glanced at his watch, then picked up the remote to turn on the TV on the filing cabinet. You know, when I came down to the Met from the Glasgow 30 years ago, I thought I'd left cowboys like you behind. People are better mannered down here. Know what I mean? Yeah, they threaten you more politely. Lane glared at him. I never imagined for a minute I'd be haunted by some Highland hard case just as I'm looking forward to retirement. He turned up the sound on the television. They were reporting again on the death of Prime Minister. And Lane clearly wanted to hear it. McNeil glanced at the framed photograph of the DCI and his wife, which sat on the bookcase behind his desk. They were an old couple. Lane came from the old school of working class Glasgow cop. He swore, he made crude jokes, he was physically aggressive. He wore bridal cream in his hair and slapped Old Spice freely onto shiny shaved drink-vein chicks. You smelled him before you saw him. His wife, on the other hand, was a gentle lady, a doctor's daughter from the Chelsea who liked opera and theatre and lectured in English and drama at the Queen Mary University of London. They lived somewhere out west in a large terraced townhouse. Lang was a different man in her company. McNeil had no idea what she saw in him, but whatever it was, she brought out the best in him. Some people did that to you. McNeil reflected that while Martha might not have brought out the worst in him, she certainly hadn't brought out the best. He envied Lang his relationship. He glanced through the open door into the detective's room. There were only a couple of DCs on duty and a handful of uniform and administrative staff. The pandemic had taken its toll here too. Something on the news caught his attention, and he turned to see a lineup of dark suited men sitting at a table, groaning with microphones. They all wore masks, as did the journalist firing the questions. Center table was a man whose face had become familiar during these last few months, even behind the mask. He had large dark eyes beneath thick black eyebrows that contrasted with blonde crew cut hair, and wore distinctive silver rimmed oval spectacles. He had a creamy smooth voice which spoke English with just a hint of foreign accent whose origin was impossible to define. His name was Roger Bloom, and he was the doctor in charge of the Steen Franks Flu-Kill Pandemic Task Force. Fucking leeches. Lang's expletive echoed McNeil's unspoken thought. I see their share price is up again. Steen Frankel was the French-based pharmaceutical company whose antivirus drug, Flu-Kill, had been singled out by the World Health Organization during the run-up to the pandemic as the remedy most likely to be ineffective against the bird flu. Should it ever become transmissible from human to human? The WHO had also warned that such an eventuality was inevitable. As a result, those countries around the world who could afford it had placed more than 3.5 billion euros worth of orders. Britain alone had bought nearly 15 million courses to treat a quarter of the population. Health and law enforcement workers were to be the first in line to receive it. Not that it was a cure, the best that could be hoped for was an amelioration of symptoms and a shortening of the course of the flu, making survival more likely. And with a more mortality rate of nearly 80%, anything that could improve your odds was in huge demand. The Steen Franks press conference was to announce a further stepping up of Flu-Kill production to meet the increased requirement. A cynical journalist amongst the press pack asked Dr. Bloom if the increase in the production might have anything to do with the announcement by several developing countries that they intend to produce their own generic form of the drug. Bloom easily shrugged off the clear implication that his company was only interested in maintaining its monopoly. We have a brand new facility in France, custom made to produce Flu-Kill, he said. It comes online next week. It has been a long time in the planning, so this is no rush move to fight off the competition. We can produce the drug faster and more efficiently than anyone else. And we have all the quality controls in place to ensure its effectiveness. Your vaccine didn't prove very effective. The journalist's tone reflected the general feeling of resentment around the country that anyone should profit from the disaster. A matter of great regret, said Bloom, not for any crass commercial reason, but because of the lives it might have saved. And why didn't work and otherwise fired off its accusation? Because we guessed wrong, Bloom said simply. Bird flu has been around for a long time. But it was only 1997 that we confirmed the first human case of it. On that occasion, the virus was transmitted from bird to human. But from that moment on, it was only a matter of time before the bird virus combined with the human flu virus, making it transmissible from human to human. We knew when that happened, the human race would be in big trouble. A pandemic was inevitable and would almost certainly be worse than Spanish flu of 1918. That killed 50 million people. So the race was on to find a way of beating it this time before it began. He ran a hand back across his bristly skull. We, along with many others, tried to create in the laboratory something that would look to immune system like a humanly transmissible avian flu, and so create a vaccine that involved mixing and matching genes from H5N1 bird flu virus with a common human flu virus. For that purpose, we chose the H3N2 strain, which had been behind most recent human flu outbreaks. The doctor shook his head. The goal was to substitute the 8 genes of each virus, one by one, with the 8 genes from the other to see which combination would create version easily spread amongst humans. The trouble was that with the more than 250 possible combinations, hitting on the right one was a bit like winning the lottery. But you thought you'd done it. Yes, because when the real virus actually emerged, we found we had created something almost identical. The trouble was, it was just different enough that the immune system wasn't fooled, and we knew it was going to take anything up to 6 months to put that right. So, has anyone at Stain Franks come up with a reasonable explanation of why the pandemic started in London rather than Asia? That's not her job, said Bloom smoothly. If he detected the hostility coming from his questioners, he was ignoring it. It's something you'll need to ask the Health Protection Agency. He paused. But you don't have to be very smart to figure that it only takes one infected individual from Vietnam or Thailand or Cambodia to fly into London, New York, or Paris, and you've sown the seed. In this modern age of air travel, we really do live in a global village, and we've created the perfect incubators for breeding and passing on infection in the buses and planes and underground trains we travel on. We were a human disaster waiting to happen. The newscast cut back to the studio and breaking news of a development in the race to fill the power vacuum left by the death of the PM. But by now, Ling had lost interest and turned it off. He swiveled in his chair and looked spectrally at McNeil. You're fucking idiot, man. Quitting now. You're a good co. He hesitated. The compliment had been grudging, something he was loath to admit. You could have been sitting in my seat in a few years. By which time Sean would nearly have finished school. McNeil shook his head. There's no second chances with kids. You can't turn the clock back on childhood. He looked beyond Lang, out of the window to Kennington Road below, the shop and restaurant opposite the police station, Trafalgar Lock and Key, Perdoni's restaurant, Peter's Rand hairstylist, the Imperial Tandoori, all more familiar to him than his own son. He'd spent more time in the company of Lang, for God's sake. Lang said, I'll need to ask for your flu kill back before you clock off tomorrow. McNeil looked at him. I'm sorry. Jack, you're no longer on the front line, or at least you won't be. Fine. Lang slapped his palms on his desk. You've got 2 hours to get that site searched before I send the diggers back in.